On the morning of the 26th of May 1940, the German army had done something military experts thought impossible. They had driven a massive armoured wedge through the Ardennes forest, split the Allied forces in two, and now they were squeezing the British Expeditionary Force against the French coastline like water being wrung from a cloth. The port of Dunkirk was all that remained between 300,000 British soldiers and complete annihilation. The situation was genuinely catastrophic. Lord Gort, commanding the British Expeditionary Force, had received orders from London to fight his way south and link up with French forces. But Gort understood what the politicians in London could not yet see from their maps. The French armies were collapsing, the Belgians were about to surrender, and his own force was being herded into an ever-shrinking pocket with their backs to the sea. What happened next would define Britain's war. On the 26th of May, the Admiralty launched Operation Dynamo under Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, working from his headquarters tunnelled into the White Cliffs beneath Dover Castle. The initial estimates were grim. Naval planners hoped to rescue perhaps 30,000 men over 2 days before the Germans overwhelmed the beaches. They were preparing, in essence, to save a fragment and lose an army. But the evacuation that unfolded over the next 9 days became something altogether different. The famous little ships, the pleasure boats and fishing vessels and river ferries joined Royal Navy destroyers and merchant vessels in a desperate shuttle across the Channel. German aircraft strafed the beaches, artillery shells churned the sand, and still the lines of soldiers waded into the surf, waiting hours for their turn to escape. By the 4th of June, when the last British rearguard units surrendered, 338,226 Allied troops had been pulled from Dunkirk. Of these, nearly 200,000 were British. It was a genuine miracle of improvisation and courage, yet here is what the celebrations in Britain obscured. Those soldiers came home, but virtually nothing else did. The British Expeditionary Force abandoned 2,472 artillery pieces on the beaches. They left behind 63,879 vehicles. They lost 509 tanks. 90,000 rifles lay scattered across the Dunkirk perimeter. General Alan Brooke, who would later become Chief of the Imperial General Staff, wrote in his diary that Britain now possessed barely enough equipment to arm 2 divisions properly. 2 divisions to defend an island against the most powerful military machine the world had ever seen. Churchill understood this reality even as he rallied the nation. His famous speech to Parliament on the 4th of June contained the immortal lines about fighting on the beaches, but it also included a passage often forgotten. He reminded the House that wars are not won by evacuations. Dunkirk was a deliverance, not a victory. The German High Command now controlled the entire European coastline from Norway to Spain. The Luftwaffe was repositioning to airfields just minutes from English shores, and Britain stood alone, stripped of its army's equipment, waiting for an invasion that seemed inevitable. This was the position from which Britain would somehow have to fight its way back. 28 months later, the Eighth Army would smash Rommel's forces at El Alamein and begin the liberation of an entire continent. But on that June morning in 1940, such a victory would have seemed like fantasy. The question that faced Churchill's government was brutally simple. Where could Britain possibly strike back? The answer would come from the most unlikely direction, not across the Channel, but across the Mediterranean, in the burning sands of North Africa. While the exhausted soldiers of the British Expeditionary Force were still being processed through reception centres across southern England, Churchill was already making one of the most audacious strategic decisions of the entire war. He would send precious tanks and equipment not to defend Britain's beaches, but 4,000 miles away to Egypt. This seems almost incomprehensible when you consider the situation. In June 1940, Britain genuinely expected a German invasion within weeks. The Home Guard was drilling with broomsticks because there were not enough rifles. Anti-tank defences consisted largely of concrete blocks and requisitioned cars, and yet Churchill ordered 154 tanks, including 50 of the new Matilda Mark IIs, loaded onto fast convoy ships bound for the Suez Canal. The reasoning behind this apparent madness reveals how Churchill understood the war differently from his generals. Britain was an island nation that depended entirely on maritime trade. The Suez Canal was the artery connecting Britain to its empire, to Indian manpower, to Australian wheat, to the oil of the Persian Gulf. If Germany and Italy could sever that artery, they would strangle Britain without ever crossing the Channel. Italy had entered the war on the 10th of June 1940, just as France was collapsing. Mussolini commanded an army of over 200,000 men in Libya, directly threatening Egypt. Another 200,000 Italian troops occupied Ethiopia and Italian Somaliland, menacing Sudan and Kenya. On paper, the Italian position looked overwhelming. General Archibald Wavell, commanding British forces in the Middle East, had just 36,000 troops scattered across an enormous theatre stretching from Palestine to East Africa. His tank strength was pitiful. His air force was outnumbered 4-1. And he was receiving instructions from London that must have seemed detached from reality, telling him to prepare offensive operations. But Wavell possessed something the Italians lacked. He had been studying his enemy carefully, and he understood that numbers alone do not win wars. The Italian forces in Libya were poorly equipped, badly led, and spread across defensive positions that invited defeat in detail. Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, commanding the Italian 10th Army, showed no appetite for offensive action despite Mussolini's constant demands. When Graziani finally advanced into Egypt in September 1940, he moved just 60 miles across the border before stopping at Sidi Barrani. There his army constructed a series of fortified camps spread across an impossibly wide front, with gaps of 15 miles between positions. Wavell looked at the Italian dispositions and saw opportunity. Throughout the autumn of 1940, while the Battle of Britain raged in the skies over England, Wavell was quietly assembling his strike force. The tanks Churchill had risked sending through the Mediterranean arrived safely. The 7th Armoured Division, already hardened by months of desert patrolling, trained relentlessly for the operation ahead. A deception plan convinced Italian intelligence that the British were preparing to withdraw further into Egypt. The commander chosen for the assault was Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor, a quiet, unassuming Irishman who had never commanded anything larger than a division. He was given 30,000 troops and 275 tanks, told to conduct a limited 5-day raid against the Italian forward positions and then withdraw. What followed would become one of the most spectacular military victories in British history, but nobody in December 1940 imagined that O'Connor's modest raid would transform into a campaign that captured 130,000 prisoners and destroyed an entire Italian army. The Western Desert Force was about to demonstrate that Britain, despite Dunkirk, could still produce shattering offensive victories. At 7:30 on the morning of the 9th of December 1940, the Western Desert Force struck the Italian camp at Nebewa with complete surprise. The Italian garrison was preparing breakfast when Matilda tanks crashed through the perimeter walls and infantry from the 4th Indian Division poured into the compound. Within hours, the camp had fallen. General Pietro Maletti, commanding the garrison, was killed fighting in his pajamas. O'Connor's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than attacking the Italian positions frontally, he would swing his force through a gap in the enemy line, then roll up the camps one by one from the rear. The Italians, expecting any attack to come from the east, had oriented their defences entirely in the wrong direction. By nightfall on the 9th of December, 3 fortified camps had been overrun and 2,000 prisoners were marching into captivity. The Matilda Mark II proved devastatingly effective. Italian anti-tank guns simply bounced shells off its heavy armour. Tank crews reported being hit dozens of times without penetration. The psychological effect on Italian soldiers was crushing. They had been told the British were finished, yet here were these monstrous machines grinding through their positions, seemingly immune to everything thrown at them. What had been planned as a 5-day raid now transformed into something far more ambitious. On the 11th of December, O'Connor's forces stormed the coastal town of Sidi Barrani. The Italian garrison surrendered after brief resistance, yielding another 20,000 prisoners. Wavell, recognizing the scale of the opportunity, authorized O'Connor to pursue the retreating Italians into Libya itself. The advance that followed reads like something from a military fantasy. On the 3rd of January 1941, Australian troops assaulted the fortress of Bardia, capturing 45,000 Italians, along with 462 artillery pieces and 129 tanks. 3 weeks later, Tobruk fell after a single day's fighting, adding another 25,000 prisoners to the growing total. O'Connor was not satisfied. He understood that the Italian 10th Army was disintegrating and that a complete victory lay within his grasp. But the retreating Italians still possessed one escape route, the coastal road running through Benghazi and south towards Tripoli. If they reached Tripoli, they could regroup and fight again. The solution O'Connor devised was characteristically bold. While Australian forces pursued the Italians along the coast road, he would send the 7th Armoured Division on a 150-mile dash across the unmapped desert interior to cut the road at Bida Fom before the retreating columns could escape. This was an enormous gamble. The armoured division would be operating far beyond any possibility of support, their tanks worn down by 2 months of continuous operations, their fuel supplies stretched to the absolute limit. If the Italians fought through, the British force would be stranded and destroyed. On the 5th of February 1941, advance units of the 7th Armoured Division reached the coast road just 30 minutes before the leading Italian columns arrived. What followed was a running battle lasting 2 days, as increasingly desperate Italian forces tried repeatedly to break through the British blocking position. Every attack failed. On the 7th of February, the Italian 10th Army surrendered. O'Connor's force of 36,000 men had advanced 500 miles, destroyed 10 Italian divisions, and captured 130,000 prisoners, along with 845 artillery pieces and 380 tanks. British casualties amounted to 500 dead and 1,300 wounded. It was an annihilating victory. And then, at the very moment when O'Connor was preparing to advance on Tripoli and sweep the Italians from Africa entirely, everything fell apart. On the 12th of February 1941, just 5 days after the Italian surrender at Bida Fom, a German general stepped off a transport aircraft at Tripoli airport. His name was Erwin Rommel, and he had been sent by Hitler to prevent the complete collapse of the Axis position in North Africa. He was supposed to command a small blocking force to stabilize the front and to wait for reinforcements before considering any offensive action. Rommel had other ideas. Within hours of arriving, he was driving forward to inspect the front lines. What he found alarmed him. Italian morale had completely shattered. Retreating columns were still streaming westward. But he also noticed something encouraging. The British pursuit had halted. The forward units looked thin on the ground, and reconnaissance suggested they were not preparing to advance. The reason for this British hesitation was strategic rather than tactical. Churchill had made a fateful decision. Greece was facing imminent German invasion, and the Prime Minister felt honour-bound to send assistance. On the 10th of March, the experienced Australian divisions and much of O'Connor's armoured strength began embarking for Greece. The Western Desert Force was stripped to a skeleton. O'Connor himself was pulled from command, replaced by Lieutenant General Philip Neame, who had never commanded armoured forces and did not know the desert. The veteran 7th Armoured Division was withdrawn to refit in Egypt, replaced by the inexperienced 2nd Armoured Division, which arrived in theatre with broken-down tanks and crews who had never fired their weapons in combat. Rommel saw his opportunity and seized it. On the 31st of March, ignoring direct orders from Berlin to remain defensive, he launched his forces eastward. The depleted British formations crumbled before his assault. Within 2 weeks, Rommel had recaptured all the territory O'Connor had won, pushing the British back to the Egyptian frontier. In the chaos of the retreat, both Neame and O'Connor, who had been sent forward to advise, were captured when their staff car drove into a German patrol. Only one position held. The port of Tobruk, surrounded by Italian-built fortifications, was garrisoned by the Australian 9th Division under Major General Leslie Morshead. When Rommel's forces swept past, Morshead refused to withdraw. Tobruk became an Axis thorn, a besieged fortress behind enemy lines that tied down German troops and threatened Rommel's supply route. The siege of Tobruk would last 240 days, becoming a symbol of Australian defiance and Commonwealth resilience. The garrison endured constant artillery bombardment, repeated ground assaults, and the grinding misery of dust, heat, and limited water. German propaganda mockingly called them the Rats of Tobruk. The defenders adopted the name with pride. Through the summer of 1941, Churchill demanded offensive action to relieve Tobruk and push Rommel back. Wavell launched Operation Brevity in May, a limited attack that achieved nothing. Operation Battleaxe followed in June, a larger effort that Rommel shattered within 3 days, destroying nearly half the British tank force. Churchill, frustrated beyond endurance, sacked Wavell and replaced him with General Claude Auchinleck. Auchinleck refused to be rushed. He spent 5 months rebuilding the Western Desert Force, now redesignated the 8th Army, accumulating tanks and supplies for a properly prepared offensive. On the 18th of November 1941, Operation Crusader began with over 700 tanks surging across the frontier. The battle that followed was a chaotic, swirling tank melee spread across hundreds of square miles of desert. Both sides attacked, retreated, regrouped, and attacked again. Rommel personally led a dash to the Egyptian border that nearly destroyed British headquarters. For days, nobody could tell who was winning. But the 8th Army, despite appalling losses, kept fighting. Operation Crusader eventually succeeded, but the cost was staggering. By the time Rommel withdrew from the Tobruk perimeter in early December 1941, the 8th Army had lost over 18,000 casualties and 750 tanks. The Germans and Italians had suffered similarly, and Rommel pulled back to El Agheila, almost exactly where O'Connor had destroyed the Italian army 10 months earlier. The Desert War had become a bloody pendulum, swinging back and forth across the same barren ground. Both sides paused to lick their wounds. The British pushed reinforcements forward, extending their supply lines ever further from the Egyptian railheads. Rommel received fresh tanks and troops through Tripoli, his supply situation improving as he shortened his lines of communication. By January 1942, the balance was shifting again. Rommel struck on the 21st of January, catching the British completely off guard. Exhausted units that thought they were resting found themselves fighting for survival. Within 2 weeks, the The Eighth Army had retreated nearly 300 miles, abandoning Benghazi and vast quantities of supplies. By early February, the front stabilized on the Gazala line, a series of fortified positions stretching from the coast south into the desert, protected by nearly 500,000 landmines. For 3 months, both armies prepared for the next round. Auchinleck wanted to wait until he possessed overwhelming superiority before attacking. Churchill bombarded him with demands for immediate action. Rommel, as always, planned to strike first. On the 26th of May 1942, Rommel launched Operation Venezia. His plan was characteristically bold. While Italian infantry demonstrated against the Gazala line's northern sector, his armoured divisions would sweep around the southern flank in a vast encircling movement, then drive north to trap the entire British force against the coast. The initial attack achieved complete surprise, but then things began going wrong. British armoured units fought more effectively than Rommel expected. His forces became scattered and disorganised. By the 28th of May, Rommel's tanks were running low on fuel and ammunition, pinned against the rear of the British minefields in an area that became known as the Cauldron. This was the moment when aggressive British action could have destroyed the Afrika Korps entirely. Rommel himself later admitted that the 28th of May was the day he thought he had lost the battle, but the British response was hesitant and piecemeal. Counterattacks went in separately rather than concentrated, and Rommel's anti-tank guns destroyed them in detail. By the 1st of June, Rommel had blasted corridors through the minefields and resumed his offensive. The Free French garrison at Bir Hakeim held out heroically for 10 days, buying time that the British command failed to exploit. When Bir Hakeim finally fell on the 11th of June, Rommel turned his full strength against the British armour. The tank battles that followed were catastrophic for the Eighth Army. On the 12th and 13th of June, in fighting around the Knightsbridge position, British armoured strength was shattered. By the 14th of June, the Eighth Army was in full retreat towards Egypt. The Gazala line had collapsed. Now came the crowning disaster. Tobruk, the fortress that had held for 240 days in 1941, was supposed to be evacuated. But confused orders and poor planning left the garrison in place, surrounded by Rommel's forces. On the 20th of June, the final assault began. By the morning of the 21st, Major General Hendrik Klopper surrendered with 33,000 men. Churchill received the news while meeting with President Roosevelt in Washington. He later described it as one of the heaviest blows of the entire war. For Britain, Tobruk was a humiliation that demanded answers. The fall of Tobruk sent shockwaves through the British establishment. In Parliament, a motion of no confidence was tabled against Churchill's government. The Prime Minister survived the vote by 475 to 25, but the criticism stung. Something had gone profoundly wrong with the British Army in the desert, and everyone knew it. Rommel, meanwhile, saw the road to Egypt lying open. Against the advice of his superiors, who wanted him to pause and consolidate, he drove his exhausted forces eastward in pursuit of the retreating Eighth Army. On the 23rd of June, his tanks crossed the Egyptian frontier. On the 28th, they captured Mersa Matruh, along with another 6,000 prisoners. Alexandria seemed within reach. Panic gripped Cairo. The British embassy began burning classified documents. Civilians crowded the railway stations, seeking passage to Palestine. Staff officers quietly packed their personal belongings. The Royal Navy evacuated Alexandria harbour, dispersing the Mediterranean fleet to Haifa and Port Said. An ashy haze from burning paperwork hung over British headquarters, and wags christened the 29th of June as Ash Wednesday. But Rommel had outrun his strength. His divisions were down to a handful of operational tanks. His troops had been fighting and marching for over a month without rest. Fuel supplies were critically short. and standing between his depleted forces and the Nile Delta was a defensive position unlike anything he had encountered before. El Alamein offered no flanks to turn. To the north lay the Mediterranean. To the south, 40 miles away, lay the Qattara Depression, a vast, sunken wasteland of salt marshes and sand seas impassable to vehicles. Any attacking force would have to punch straight through the defenders. The desert that had favored mobile warfare for 2 years had finally presented a choke point. Auchinleck himself had taken direct command of the 8th Army following the Gazala disaster, sacking General Neil Ritchie on the 25th of June. Now the Commander-in-Chief Middle East was personally directing the defense, shuttling between units, steadying shaken commanders, organizing counterattacks. His calm presence helped stabilize an army that had been reeling towards collapse. On the 1st of July, Rommel struck the Alamein position with everything he had left. The attack fell primarily on the 18th Indian Brigade, newly arrived and holding a position called Deir el-Shein. The Indians fought with extraordinary tenacity, holding out for an entire day against overwhelming odds before being overrun. That single day's delay disrupted Rommel's timetable fatally. The following days brought repeated German and Italian attacks, each one weaker than the last. Auchinleck responded with aggressive counterstrokes that kept the Axis forces off balance. On the 10th of July, Australian troops stormed the coastal position at Tel El Isa, capturing vital ground and threatening Rommel's communications. On the 14th and 15th of July, New Zealand and Indian formations attacked at Ruwaisat Ridge in fierce fighting that cost both sides dearly. By the 27th of July, the First Battle of El Alamein had ground to an exhausted halt. Neither side possessed the strength to continue attacking. Rommel's great offensive had been stopped just 60 miles from Alexandria. The Afrika Korps would never advance another inch towards Cairo. Auchinleck had saved Egypt. This is not an exaggeration or patriotic embellishment. He had taken a beaten army, steadied it under fire, and fought Rommel to a standstill through sheer determination and tactical skill. Yet within 2 weeks of this achievement, Churchill decided to sack him. The Prime Minister wanted victory, not stalemate. He wanted an offensive, and Auchinleck insisted the army needed time to rebuild. Churchill flew to Cairo in early August, mind already made up. Changes were coming. On the 13th of August 1942, Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery arrived in the Egyptian desert to take command of the 8th Army. He was an abrasive, self-promoting officer whom many colleagues found insufferable. He was also exactly what the 8th Army needed. Montgomery understood that the Army's problems ran deeper than tactics or equipment. The men had lost confidence in their leadership. Too many offensives had been launched prematurely. Too many attacks had gone in piecemeal. Too many retreats had been ordered just when soldiers thought they were winning. Montgomery's first priority was restoring belief that victory was possible. He began with simple, visible gestures. He cancelled all contingency plans for further withdrawal. He visited every unit personally, standing on the bonnet of his jeep to address the troops in his high, distinctive voice. He told them there would be no more retreats. They would fight where they stood, and if they could not stay alive there, they would stay dead there. The bluntness was deliberate and effective. General Harold Alexander arrived simultaneously as Commander-in-Chief Middle East, replacing Auchinleck. Where Montgomery was prickly and egotistical, Alexander was charming and diplomatic. Together they formed an effective partnership. Alexander handled Churchill and the strategic picture, whilst shielding Montgomery from political interference. Montgomery focused entirely on destroying Rommel. The timing proved fortunate. Rommel was planning one final offensive, determined to break through to the Nile before the British could rebuild. On the 30th of August, the Afrika Korps swung south around the Alamein position, aiming to sweep behind the British lines and encircle the Eighth Army. It was the same flanking manoeuvre that had worked repeatedly throughout the Desert Campaign. This time Montgomery was waiting. He had correctly anticipated Rommel's attack and concentrated his forces on the Alam-Halfa ridge, directly in the path of the German advance. When Rommel's tanks emerged from the minefields, they found themselves driving into prepared defences rather than open desert. British artillery and dug-in tanks savaged the attacking columns. Rommel pushed his forces against Alam-Halfa for 3 days, suffering mounting casualties and burning irreplaceable fuel. On the 2nd of September, he ordered withdrawal. The British pursuit was deliberately cautious. Montgomery refused to risk his armoured forces in a mobile battle where Rommel's tactical genius might produce an upset. He would fight on his own terms when he was ready. The preparations that followed were meticulous and comprehensive. Montgomery demanded overwhelming superiority before attacking, and he got it. By late October, the Eighth Army possessed 195,000 men against 104,000 Axis troops. British tank strength reached over 1,000 against 500 German and Italian machines. Artillery batteries multiplied. Supply dumps swelled. Equally important was Operation Bertram, an elaborate deception scheme designed to convince Rommel that the main attack would come in the south. Dummy tanks and vehicles proliferated in southern positions. A fake pipeline was constructed, deliberately built at a pace suggesting completion weeks after the actual attack date. Meanwhile, real forces concentrating in the north were hidden beneath camouflage netting designed to look like lorries and supply dumps. Ultra-intelligence derived from breaking German Enigma codes gave Montgomery priceless advantages. He knew Rommel's supply situation was desperate, with fuel shipments being sunk by British submarines and aircraft. He knew German tank strength and unit positions. He knew Rommel himself had fallen ill and returned to Germany for medical treatment, leaving General Georg Stumme temporarily in command. On the evening of the 23rd of October, 1942, over 1,000 British guns opened fire along the Alamein line. Operation Lightfoot had begun. The Eighth Army was finally attacking with everything it had. The barrage that shattered the desert silence at 20 minutes to 10 on the 23rd of October was the heaviest the British Army had ever fired. 1,000 artillery pieces hurled shells into Axis positions for 20 minutes, then shifted to create corridors through which infantry would advance. Sappers moved forward under fire to clear paths through the Devil's Gardens, the vast minefields sown with nearly 500,000 German and Italian mines. Montgomery's plan was straightforward but demanding. Infantry divisions would punch through the minefields in the north, creating gaps through which armoured divisions would pour to destroy enemy tanks beyond. The southern sector would launch diversionary attacks to pin Axis reserves. Success depended on speed, achieving breakthrough before Rommel could organise a coherent defence. The first night brought mixed results. Infantry from the 51st Highland Division and the 2nd New Zealand Division pushed into the minefields, suffering heavy casualties but gaining ground. But the armoured divisions became stuck in the narrow corridors, unable to break through into open desert. By dawn, tanks were milling behind the infantry rather than racing ahead to exploit success. General Stumme drove forward to assess the situation personally on the 24th of October. When his vehicle came under fire, Stumme suffered a fatal heart attack and tumbled from the car unnoticed. His body was not discovered until the following day. Rommel, still recovering in Germany, received an urgent summons from Hitler and flew back immediately, arriving late on the 25th. Rommel found a battle already slipping away from him, Fuel shortages prevented large-scale armoured counterattacks. His forces were committed piecemeal and destroyed piecemeal, yet the British advance had also stalled. The fighting degenerated into brutal attrition among the minefields and defensive positions, both sides feeding units into a grinding struggle that consumed men and machines at appalling rates. Montgomery remained calm. He had anticipated a hard fight and planned accordingly. When his initial thrust bogged down, he reorganized and refocused, pulling the 2nd New Zealand Division out of the line and concentrating forces for a fresh blow. On the 2nd of November, Operation Supercharge launched against the weakened Axis centre. Australian troops attacking along the coastal sector had already drawn Rommel's reserves northward. Now New Zealand infantry and British armour struck further south, punching through the thinning defences. The fighting was ferocious. The 9th Armoured Brigade charged anti-tank gun positions at dawn, losing 70 of its 94 tanks, but creating the crucial gap. Rommel committed his final reserves to seal the breach. By the 3rd of November, Rommel recognised the battle was lost. He requested permission to withdraw. Hitler responded with his infamous stand-fast order, demanding that every man hold his position to the death. Rommel hesitated, then obeyed. It cost him 24 precious hours and thousands of additional prisoners. On the 4th of November, British armour finally broke through into open desert. Axis forces began streaming westward in disorganised retreat. Rommel, ignoring Hitler's orders, authorised general withdrawal to save what remained of his army. The pursuit would continue for months, across Libya and into Tunisia, but the decisive moment had passed. The Second Battle of El Alamein cost the 8th Army 13,500 casualties. Axis losses exceeded 30,000, including some 30,000 prisoners. Rommel's army had been broken. When Churchill addressed Parliament on the 10th of November, he offered a phrase that would define the battle's significance for history. Before Alamein, he said, "We never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." 28 months after Dunkirk, Britain had finally proven it could win.